A game is like a sausage. Everybody loves sausages. But who among you thinks about how they're made, where they come from, or the people who make them? This story is about the making of my sausage game. I think we're done with the sausage metaphor for now. I've spent a year developing a game, almost entirely solo. That means any engineering, any artwork, any animations, any other weird thing, crazy thing that needs to get done, I gotta do it. Now before we get all chronological, let me just tell you a little bit about the game I'm making. The working title is Badventure, and we don't have a logo yet, if you couldn't tell. The basic idea is that any lobby of players will include a dungeon master and a party of adventurers. The dungeon master uses their budget every round to set up a room with a layout, enemies, and traps. The party of adventurers works together to clear the last room that the dungeon master set up, and when they finish clearing it, they get a juicy loot payout. If all the adventurers tragically die, the dungeon master wins. If the adventurers beat all the rounds or clear a room faster than the dungeon master can set up the next one, then the adventurers win. I want the game to be a hedonistic matrimony of mechanics from some of my favorite and critically acclaimed titles like The Binding of Isaac, Don't Starve Together, Risk of Rain, and Pummel Party. If you can see their influence in my work, that's legit. And before we move on to the story, I just want to say if the game sounds interesting to you and you'd like to support it without listening to the rest of this glorified devlog, then please check below for a link to the Discord. Building a community is by far the hardest part of releasing an indie game, so the best thing you can do to support the project at this stage is to just come hang out in the Discord. That being said, subscribes and likes for the YouTube algorithm are also nice, and that's enough shilling till the end of the video. Now for some backstory. My name is Bjorn, my friends say I have sausage fingers, and I've been working on games for about 3 years now. Before then, I never had a job in the industry, and I have no relevant degrees, except maybe a physics degree if you stretch it. But I love games, and I want to make them. Before Badventure, I was working with a small team on a multiplayer, extraction, Souls-like kind of concept. We put together a demo, and we got it in front of several large publishers and did a few playtests. Mostly the publishers said kind of the same thing. They said, "We like the concept, but we don't think your team can pull it off." I was asking for a lot of money, and I'm not the guy they typically like to throw money at. They have a methodology for distributing their capital, and I don't really fit the criteria. So I decided to make something I wouldn't need a big budget for, or a large team, or a miracle. I decided to make a game that I could make. All by myself if I had to. What to make? Well, the idea for this game was born out of two colliding thoughts in my head. The first thought was about how I like to troll my friends in games. This isn't generally acceptable behavior, but what if it was? The next insight was about how for the Dungeon Master in a Dungeons & Dragons game, the fun comes from creating and managing an adventure, whereas for the adventurers, the fun comes from overcoming challenges that were set up by someone within their group. D&D is cool and popular, but it's complicated. What if there was a simpler, sexier, more streamlined version with blackjack and hook? So I had the basic premise. An asymmetrical, multiplayer, roguelike dungeon crawler? Something like that. Because this game had to be achievable by a one-man army, an underlying mandate to all the design decisions is to reduce the complexity of execution. Certain elements of the design are already predicated by the idea, such as having multiplayer. More on that later, but in general, I wanted to try and balance the scope. If I added too many features, the project will get too large to be achievable. So most games start off as a game loop. It's generally the first thing to be figured out from a design perspective. For an RPG, this is something like explore, kill monsters, get loot, get stronger, repeat. Players cycle through these actions in a lifelong addiction to a false reality, and that's gaming. Badventure has two interlocking game loops, the Adventurer loop and the Dungeon Master loop. Roughly, they look like this. The Dungeon Master sets up rooms, trolls adventurers, and builds up their budget to give them more resources to work with. Adventurers enter a room, kill enemies, avoid traps, and get loot, which makes them stronger. Now, based on the loop, I'm sure you can imagine a number of other design elements that would need to be fleshed out, such as health, armor, item effects. I'm going to leave a lot of that for when talking about those specific features, but here, I'll show you my design document. Yeah, I use paper. Yeah, it's brief. Design is pretty iterative, so I wanted to leave room for experimentation, but the basics are there. In game design, the most basic blocking and tackling you can do is to sort out your character, controls, and camera. The 3 C's. Based on the mandate to keep things simple, I opted for a 2D game. This cuts back significantly on art time and can help a bit with engineering as well. I decided the character would be a 2D sprite, which simply flipped when changing horizontal directions and does not change perspective when moving vertically. Again, this cuts down on art significantly and it still gets the job done. For the camera, I decided to anchor it to the room rather than follow the characters. This makes things simpler, yes, but it also provides a unified view for all the players and gives them all high situational awareness. I also settled on this weird semi-top-down perspective based on a combination of artistic and gameplay factors. More on controls to come, but for now just know you can move freely using WASD, the number keys activate your hotbar, and the mouse controls your attacks. The Dungeon Master controls are largely a mouse-driven experience, think like drag and drop, but the long-term goal is to make everything feel very tactile, like you're playing with the objects you interact with. Hopefully we can make it there someday. So with the basic design framework in place, it was now time to cross the proverbial Rubicon. The big question at this point was mostly, how? I needed to make a few key decisions and live with them forever and ever. What engine to use? Well, there are tons of options, but to get up and running as fast as possible, I wanted to use one I had previous experience with. That really left Unreal Engine and Unity. Being a multiplayer game, Unreal Engine seemed like a natural fit. They have super robust multiplayer features, but there is a catch. Unreal's Paper 2D is notoriously underfeatured and underserviced. Some even question if it has been abandoned. Honestly, it probably makes them about $5 billion less a year than the Fortnite Battle Pass, so I get why it's not priority. By contrast, Unity's 2D feature set is extremely well developed, documented, and has a large community. But at the time I started, Unity's networking features were a bit lackluster. They were working on the now released new multiplayer features, but, this was then and that was now. In the end, I settled on Unity and I haven't looked back, but I did need a multiplayer networking package to fill in the gaps. I talked to some other devs and ended up settling on Mirror. Coming from Unreal Engine's multiplayer features, there was a pretty big learning curve, but Mirror has decent documentation, great notes within the codebase, and an amazing Discord community. I'm serious, this isn't one of those game dev Discords where people only ever ask for help with their basic issue and no one bothers replying to them, whether they can help or not. The Mirror community is active, and the developers even pop into the help channels to help solve problems. I really can't stress enough how good of a resource they and the community at large have been, so big props to the Mirror team and the community. You guys rule. At this point, I do want to comment a bit about multiplayer development. If making a game is like making a sausage, making a game multiplayer makes your sausage 4 to 10 times longer. Until you get a handle on it, which takes a long time, it will make everything you want to do take multiples longer than you think in both development and testing. Even when you know what you're doing, it bloats the work. So if you're interested in making a multiplayer game with no experience, I hope you're young. Okay. Engine, check. Multiplayer framework, check. Now for the pipeline. I needed to figure out what the process would be to make the artwork and get it into the engine. This largely hinged on animation, and there were two approaches I felt like I could pull off. One approach is to animate every frame with a new sprite, like most pixel art games. This is called sprite sheet animation. The other approach is to import a sprite, build or assign an armature to it, and animate it like a puppet. Because I wanted to have highly customizable characters, lots of armor and weapons, and in general, modular systems to reduce the complexity of execution, sprite sheet animation would not work for my characters. If I wanted to add a new armor to the game, I would have to hand animate every frame of every necessary animation for every character. This would be extremely time consuming, so instead I opted to use the skeletal armature so I could simply weight paint on a sprite and any animation I'd already made could work on it. It's called sprite swapping and it's pretty fantastic. I still use sprite sheet animations for other things, but for the characters, nuh-uh. However, this approach does have its quirks. The main quirk is that your character will look and operate like a paper puppet. This is generally fine and can look artistically pleasing, but it comes with some layer management issues. If you want to have an arm appear above the head but behind the body, you run into some problems. Problems I will ignore. So I made my first character, figured out the pipeline for getting it into the engine, animated some basic cycles, and wrote a basic player controller to allow me to move it around. Great, except it wasn't networked yet. Through a combination of some great tutorials, Googling, and trial and error, I made a lobby, connected 2 players, and had replicated movement and animations. Next, I wanted to simplify and modularize my code as much as a reasonable ape would. I do this in part with class inheritance. Class inheritance refers to the fact that a class can be extended into new classes, and those derived classes can inherit, modify, or extend the functionality of their parent class. If this doesn't make sense to you, that's fine. Here's an example. For lots of features in the game, I need to communicate between characters. Let's say I have an adventurer controlled by a player, a rat enemy, and a skeleton enemy. When the adventurer needs to communicate with the rat or the skeleton, it would have to be able to communicate to each individual type, aka the rat script or the skeleton script. But if the rat and the skeleton and the player all inherit from a common ancestor, the character class, then they only need to be able to communicate to that class, which is the root parent class. This also means that anything inheriting from character can use the same methods to animate or to use items, and basically makes everything much easier to scale. You only have to write the code once instead of 10 times or whatever. Long story short, if you go through the fossil record that is my code base, you can trace back the ancestry of any class through transitional and proto-species until you find a common ancestor. It looks like the tree of life. Isn't it beautiful? Maybe Ken Hovind or the Discovery Institute could use this as evidence for intelligent design, except I'm not that intelligent.
You think this is your grandpa? Use your head, son.
Okay, this is dragging on and I basically haven't done anything yet, so time to start actually working on features for the game. What's the most logical starting point? Character customization, obviously. You may not think it, but this was actually extremely important to testing my assumptions about the pipeline and future planned features. Based on this, the amount of artwork and code for much of the future development would be decided. I decided to allow for 2 sexes in the game. They could have customizable head shapes, hair, facial hair, eyes, and mouths. These customizable features would need to work with every armor item in the game. I drew a female character, added some alternative options for each of the customizable bits, and got the sprite swapping working decently quickly. This is where the first major multiplayer hurdle reared its ugly head. At the time, I was still learning the ropes of Mirror and struggled with this quite a bit, but I can use it as an example to explain a bit about how multiplayer works. Multiplayer games work by having an instance of the game run on a server and several clients connect to it. The game you are running on your computer is the client, and everything you want to do is relayed to the server and then back to all the clients. So if you input the attack key, it sends a message to the server that you want to attack. The server makes your character attack on the server, and then tells all the clients you attacked so they can show you attacking. This mimicking of the information on the server to the clients is called replication. These messages traveling back and forth between the client and the server are the backbone of multiplayer development. Now in my example, let's say I join a lobby and change my hair. The server replicates my hair change to all the connected clients. But if another player joins, they were not there to receive the message that my hair changed. So when they connect, my hair is the default hair. This is a problem, but luckily multiplayer frameworks have a way around it. By tagging a variable as a sync variable in Unity or using a rep notify in Unreal, you can tell the server to make sure that any new client connecting also gets the updated information. You can also assign functions to be called when a variable changes. So when the hair variable is changed, you can make sure to render the new hair sprite on any new client. In Mirror, there is a specific order in which all of these messages and callbacks are handled. Getting familiar with this order is critical to making a functional multiplayer game. Once I had all this working, I similarly sorted out changing skin and hair color and had a basic customization system working in the game. So now begins the long chapter of combat development in this game. There is a ton that goes into combat, and I cannot pretend I was entirely linear in my approach, but I will give you the play-by-play of how I tackled it. Let's start with the goals. I wanted to have a combat system that would allow for many types of weapons, armor, and effects to work together to create cool interactions. I wanted players to have different roles to accomplish combat objectives. I wanted it to feel skillful and chaotic at the same time, but given the limitations imposed by the format, there were some restrictions. I believe that most combat boils down to one expression: kill them before they kill you. Taking that a little further, this means do as much damage as you can while taking as little damage as you can. Let's start with dealing damage. At this point, I wanted to make my first weapon, which meant I had to make items, which meant I had to make interactables. So I set up an interactable class, added some functionality to the player controller to allow them to interact, and created an item class inheriting from the interactable. For my first weapon, I made a stick. I'm a big fan of Souls games, and the Wretch class is a bona fide classic. Badventure's equivalent, the Lunatic, would be a nude person running around with a stick. When thinking about how weapons would work, I wanted to allow for lots of flexibility in what different weapons could do. Some weapons would stop your movement or do root motion when attacking, others would be allowed to attack freely while moving. I needed ranged weapons, melee weapons, and channeling weapons. I needed weapons that could turn the player into a mechanical chicken and lay waste to whole swaths of innocent bystanders in a fire. The player would be able to equip a weapon in the right and left hand, and two-handed or dual-wielded weapons would take up both slots. The controls would be to click quickly for a light attack or press and hold to charge up a heavy attack. In order to accomplish this, I split animations into layers. One layer was for the body and a layer for each of the arms. This would allow weapons to animate only the layers that they needed to. I made a quick smack, a charging, and a lunging stab animation and implemented them on the stick. I also made a basic inventory and equipment system called the Inventory Manager to handle picking up and equipping items. I also made some default weapons for the fists when no other weapon is equipped. In order to allow the light attack and charged up heavy attack to share a button, I had to make the attack method a coroutine. Coroutines are basically a way of waiting for stuff and doing other stuff when conditions are met. In this case, I'm waiting for the player to release the attack button. If they did it in the first quarter of a second, I knew they wanted to do a light attack. If they kept holding down the button, it meant they wanted to charge an attack. If they released the button while charging, I know they want to execute the heavy attack. Hooray. With the stick successfully equipping and overriding animations, my attention turned to actually hitting things. The way it worked at the moment was when the stick was equipped, it added a new sprite to the hand socket to render the artwork, and the actual stick object was hidden from view and followed the transform of the socket. By simply adding a collider to the stick, I had a hitbox which followed the animation and could be activated and deactivated by animation events, but only on the server. I made a new class for attacks, which included a list of damage values for different damage types, so I could have a sword that did cut and lightning damage, for example, and also a list of on-hit effects. On-hit effects are catch-all for stuff that happens that isn't direct damage. On-hit effects include things like stagger, knockback, knockdown, status effects. Basically, they are super flexible, and I will touch more on that later. Now that I could theoretically hit stuff, I needed stuff to hit. I was on my way to making the first enemy, but before I did that, I wanted to get all the health and armor housekeeping sorted out. If a character took damage, they needed to lose health. Honestly, I don't even know why I bothered writing that in the script. I decided to create a health system based on heart containers, similar to games like Minecraft or Legend of Zelda. There are 3 kinds of hearts in Badventure. You've got your normal hearts, which get damaged as you would expect and need to be replenished by healing. You've got your regenerating hearts, which recover periodically over time. And you've got your fleeting hearts, which are destroyed when they take damage. Each heart has 2 points of health. You get the idea. I set up a heart script, a health bar script, and a health bar display script, and then I decided to add armor to the game. I chose to implement armor as a fortification for a heart container. Different types of armor offer different levels of damage reduction and can cover different amounts of hearts. Tier 1 armor offers 20% damage reduction, Tier 2 offers 40%, so on and so forth. These numbers are totally final and are guaranteed to never change. I created my first armor and helmet items, the Knight Armor and Knight's Helmet. These basically just swapped out or hid all the sprites of the character, so they were pretty simple to implement. When equipped, they would fortify the hearts, and Bob was my uncle. If you don't know where that expression comes from, as I didn't when I wrote this, apparently it refers to how easy it is to get something via nepotism, based on some prime minister named Bob giving his nephew a political appointment. Anyways, enough screwing around with items. I want to kill something with my new stick. Yeah, so like I said, I'm a big fan of Souls games, and Souls players know there is one enemy hated above all others: the dog. But I propose that rats are worse. I'm gonna make a rat. I did the artwork, rigged up the sprites in the editor, and started animating. In the last game I worked on, we made a boss that had 3 tails, and it turns out tails are a pain in the ass to animate, and it also turns out I love reliving trauma. Once I had the animations, I branched a class off the character family tree called the basic non-human enemy and started working with pathfinding. I downloaded an A-star package from Aaron Granberg and started to learn the ins and outs of how this was going to go down. As a side note, this package is awesome and free, and I highly recommend it. I'll link to it in the description. I decided to use a grid-based pathfinding approach, which works great for this style of game. A grid is made up of nodes, and I'm going to refer to nodes quite a bit from here on out, but basically they're just points the AI can use to navigate. Getting basic pathfinding going isn't that hard, but for this game there were some nuances. Nuance uno is that if the target was a player, which it usually is, the shortest path to them would often leave the rat above them or below them. Given how this game works, the rat and the player can't really interact in this configuration, so I needed to make the nodes above the player off limits by applying a huge penalty to them. Now the rat always pathfinds around to the player's side. The next nuance was tackling fitting through gaps. By default, the Pathfinder doesn't know how big or small the thing it's finding a path for is, and it won't calculate whether or not you can fit through a gap or into your target location. To do this, you need to apply constraints. With a constraint applied, it only looks for paths that are big enough to allow your enemy to squeeze by. Finally, if there were multiple rats, they would all try and go to the same place and not be aware of each other. This would basically lead to them blocking each other, piling up, and ultimately they behaved like imbeciles. Now, Aaron, in his infinite wisdom, did foresee this issue and introduced functionality for local avoidance. However, this feature is locked behind a paywall, and I'm not really making any money from this right now, which makes me a cheap bastard. So instead, I used the tagging system to assign each enemy a tag, and assign that tag to the nodes that they are currently occupying. Enemies can only navigate on nodes that are either untagged or have their matching tag, which means that enemies will look for the shortest path to their target, but avoid any nodes that other enemies are currently occupying. If they can't find a valid path, I tell them to look for a new target. Okay, now that we've found our path out of that tangent, back again to taking damage. Despite having a health bar and whatever, I was really not ready to just smack the enemy and deal damage. That would be too simple. No. What I needed was an intermediate layer to receive the request to deal damage and sort out all the specifics. This sounds complicated, but it's because I wanted to introduce multiple damage types, resistances, effects, yada yada, so I set about creating something called a damage receiver. Here's a rundown of how the whole system works. Let's say a player goes up to, hit a rat with a stick.
The stick has its hitbox activated on the server by the animation. When the hitbox overlaps with the rat's hitbox, it tells the weapon to do damage to the rat. The weapon then finds the rat's damage receiver and sends it the attack data, including damage types and on-hit effects. The damage receiver takes in that data and says, well, let me check on a few things, like, is my character invincible? Do we have any resistances to damage types? Damage receiver stuff. After it modifies the incoming damage, it passes the new damage to the health bar and triggers the needed on-hit effects wherever they are handled. The health bar then puts the damage values through each heart.
And at the end of the day, the rat either dies or it doesn't. And there we go. I can kill a rat, and a rat can kill me. At this point, I was happy enough with the progress on the adventurer side of the game that I wanted to turn my attention to the Dungeon Master functionality. But as is often the case, what the heart wants and what the heart needs are two different things. Before I could move on, I had to make a trap. It was between an explosive barrel and a bear trap, and I just chose the barrel. I drew an explosive barrel sprite, made a sprite sheet animation for the explosion, and at the time I went way overboard on the detail in the explosion, considering it's only on the screen for like a fraction of a second. Seriously, look at the detail in each frame, and then look at it in real time. Whoops. I made a basic trap script and then branched off an explosive barrel script from that. The barrel would be triggered whenever it took any damage and immediately explode. I wanted to make the explosion knock characters down, so I made some knockdown animations for the player and my pet rat, and just when I thought I would finally be able to move on and work on the Dungeon Master, I realized I had a big refactor on my hands. So we all know when someone's playing a game, they're giving lots of inputs to do different things. Moving, attacking, using items, gaming. Some actions can be mutually exclusive, some could interrupt each other, and the more actions you allow players to do, the more complicated it becomes to manage that. In the beginning, I was doing things like just checking a bool or something like that for if the player wanted to do something. Like, let's say they were attacking and input another attack. Well, if the bool said they were already attacking, then we don't let them interrupt their attack. But if they get staggered while attacking, we do interrupt it. But if they attack while staggered, and it kind of grows in complexity the more stuff you add. I had to work on something called an action manager. This namespace would basically create objects called actions whenever the player wanted to do something. Actions could be assigned a list of interrupting actions and call functionality on the owning character and items when the action started, completed, or was interrupted. This would allow for a much easier time controlling the flow of actions, and actions would clean up after themselves when they got interrupted or completed whatever they needed to do. Characters have a current action assigned, and when they try and do anything else, they check against that current action to see if they can actually interrupt it. By default, and whenever an action completes, their current action is assigned something called a nothing action, which can be interrupted by literally anything else. Introducing another multiplayer headache: latency. When the client and server send messages to each other, these messages take a little bit of time to arrive at their destination. This delay is called latency and depends mostly on the actual physical distance the message has to travel in real life and the connection speeds of your internet. Latency causes a bunch of issues, but for an action manager, the main issue is that the client and the server have a different idea about what the current action is during the brief periods of delay. When the client says, I want to create a new action, it sends a message to the server to make that action. When the server makes it, it is assigned to the current action on the server. Then a message is sent back to the client to make the action and assign it to the current action on the client. While these messages are in transit, the client and the server don't have the same information about what the current action is. Ultimately, I want the server to be authoritative, so the server decides and the clients follow. What I ended up doing is making sure the client knows that their action is queued while it's traveling to the server. If they input another action while their action is queued, it is basically ignored. There's probably a better way to do this for a more responsive experience, and I will probably come back to it later, but for now this solution works and everybody gets along like a big happy family. It's finally time for the kinky stuff. I'd gotten some rudimentary functionality together for the adventurer side of the game, but I hadn't really put a lot of attention into the dungeon master side. That changed today. The first thing I did was create a dungeon master controller and make it assignable to a player in the lobby. Attached to the dungeon master was a UI which would handle most of what they needed to do. Early on, I had decided I wanted the dungeon master UI to look and feel like a desk. They're basically an administrator, managing the creation and population of the dungeon in opposition to the encroaching adventurers. I set up a bare bones UI layout that would be updated later and started working on the systems I needed. The basic idea was that the dungeon master would have to work their way through a checklist of necessary features for the dungeon, including the theme or room, layout, enemies, and traps. For each item in the checklist, they would be presented with 3 randomized options, and they could re-randomize for a price to generate some new options. Their first choice would be a theme or a room, which would dictate what could be generated in each of the subsequent categories. So if they picked a room that was like a deadly unicorn funhouse, they would get layouts, enemies, and traps that all fit the deadly unicorn funhouse theme. I set up a data structure and a scriptable object for these option lists. It included things like the option, the allowed themes for that option, the cost, and things like that. With the options lists in place, I set about creating our first theme, the dungeon theme. Yeah, original, I know. But remember, I'm starting with the basics. I made some basic background artwork, which later got replaced by a more talented artist, and I set up some colliders for the walls. Next, I made several props which were also later remade by a better artist, and I used these props to create several layouts for the dungeon. And to be honest, I don't know at this point whether they are any good or not because we haven't really done enough testing with players. In any case, they work for a proof of concept. I already had an enemy and a trap, so adding those was pretty easy. So now I had the stuff to populate a room, but I needed to make the functionality for it. I started by creating a basic selector script that would include all the needed methods to populate the options, allow them to make selections, re-roll their options, and finally spawn their selections into a room. However, each of these checklist items needed a bit of custom functionality, so I branched off of this in order to make a theme selector, a layout selector, an enemy selector, and a trap selector. For the enemies and traps, I wanted to give the Dungeon Master more control over the positioning, so I implemented a drag and drop system. This would also check if they had a viable spawning location and allow them to adjust or remove already placed enemies and traps. I also limited the area that they could place these assets down because I don't want the Dungeon Master to be able to just swarm the spawn points of the adventurers with traps and enemies. I also made an enemy spawner script and attached it to the game manager. More on that next, so when a new round started, the placeholder enemies would be swapped out with the real ones. Much later, I added gold to the equation so that the Dungeon Master had to work within a certain budget when building out a room. Finally, I gave the DM the ability to move their camera back into the previous room so that they could see what the adventurers were up to and eventually, maybe, hopefully, interact with them at some point in the future. So now I had basic functionality for both the Dungeon Master and the adventurers. It was time to wrap it up so that these systems could work together to progress the game. Like any good manager, the game manager is an obsessive, micromanaging perfectionist. For Badventure, the game manager has a few jobs, but the important jobs are to progress the rounds and track win conditions. The way I set it up, a round has 2 phases, the combat phase and the looting phase. A round begins in the combat phase, and then once all the enemies are dead, it transitions into the looting phase. The looting phase ends when all the players exit the room via a portal, or a timer runs out which forces all the players to exit. Oh yeah, that radioactive hexagon is the placeholder portal. We don't have any art done for that yet. If the adventurers exit the room before the Dungeon Master has set up the next one, they win! If the adventurers clear the final round, they win! If all the adventurers die in a round, they lose! I think we talked about this already. So yeah, the game manager is in charge of all this. It keeps tabs on when all the enemies are killed, when the Dungeon Master is done setting up the next room. It times the looting phase, tells all the players to advance to the next round. Yeah, you get the idea. It also controls the loot for each round, but I'll chat a little bit more about that in the future. So now I basically had everything in place to control the flow of the game and some basic building blocks to populate it, but I still needed to prove out some concepts with new content. Back to the combat adage. Do as much damage to them as possible while taking as little damage as possible. Sun Tzu. To mitigate damage, I wanted to focus on a few mechanics. Moving out of the way, resistance, avoidance, and blocking. For blocking, I turned to everyone's favorite medieval protection device, the shield. I drew a basic heater shield crested with a golden eagle and set about making it work. The way I intended blocking to work was that each shield would have a cap for the damage it could block. Any damage up to the cap would be ignored, and any damage above the cap would go through and basically interrupt the block. The object doing the damage would check if the receiver was blocking, and if they were, then are they facing the direction that the damage is coming from? And if the answer is again yes, then calculates how much damage to let through, if any, and goes from there. It's simple, but it works. The shield was also a proof of concept for this idea of a channeling weapon. Channeling weapons are on when the attack button is held and off when it isn't. So you can think of this like if you wanted to shoot a beam out of a staff, or I don't know, hold up a shield while you're blocking. After reconfiguring the attack input system a little bit to check if a weapon was flagged as a channeling weapon, I had press and hold working on the shield. When a character successfully blocks something, they play a little animation and spawn a graphic to show that they blocked the attack. Oh yeah, I made the shield a right-handed weapon because I felt like the artwork would be really underserviced if it was in the left hand. We'd basically just be showing the backside of the shield the whole time, and shields usually have really cool stuff on the front, so I wanted to show that. Next, I wanted to create a two-handed weapon to basically figure out how that was all going to work. I made a two-handed axe, animated some attacks, a new run cycle, a new idle cycle, and called it a day. Except it wasn't a day because I made another two-handed axe. In a not-so-subtle reference to The Shining, I named it Johnny. For Johnny, I wanted to give players the ability to run around swinging wildly like a maniac. I made new custom idle and run cycles and implemented functionality to give the axe a special running attack, which would swing if the player attacked while moving. But I wasn't done there. No. I wanted this axe to make things bleed. So I made a new on-hit effect type for bleed, and bleed would basically be a status effect, but there would be lots of other effects, status or otherwise, and I needed a solution to handle all that. I decided to make something called an effect handler. The effect handler needed to be able to track all the effects on a character, add new effects, remove old ones, update the UI in places, basically be a one-stop shop for any other script that needed to figure out anything having to do with effects. I created an effect class and then also made a status effect class, which is basically just an effect with a duration. I wrote all the code needed to add and remove effects and status effects and update the UI, and I left some room for additional functionality down the line. Ranged weapons. They're hip, they're cool, rappers love them, and I had to make one. I settled on a crossbow as doing an actual bow seemed too complicated for now, and doing a gun seemed too simple. A crossbow would let me sort out several of the issues for both. The crossbow was the first weapon that actually had to have its own armature and animations. It was also the first weapon that needed to be able to be aimed. I did some artwork, I animated some simple animations, and I decided that rather than animate the bowstring, I would use a line renderer to render it. It seemed like the simpler option and would make the longbow down the line a lot easier to approach. Aiming, though, was a whole thing. In order to aim, I needed to rotate the shoulder of the character such that the crossbow was pointed at the mouse. Once upon a time, I was really good at math. I was a physicist, but now I am unpracticed and unwashed. After a long and emotional conversation with ChatGPT about trigonometry, I finally had the math worked out to go from the mouse position to an angle of the shoulder. This was all working fine on the host, but when I tried to replicate the rotation, everything broke down. Again, this comes from the order that things are executed in the engine. Usually if you want to override an animation with a rotation, you just rotate the object in late update and the rotation will apply on top of the animation. However, when using a networked transform, which is basically an easy way to replicate movement from the server to the client or vice versa, the network messages telling the client to rotate their arm are synchronized in the update. So I had to basically add a little functionality to the network transform to allow it to synchronize in late update as well. Additionally, I had to make sure to send all the other clients the target mouse position in late update so that they knew where the rotation was trying to go. After some finagling, I had it working. Finally, and by the way, this is just to get the character holding and aiming the crossbow, I had to use inverse kinematics to make their other arm follow the rotation by sticking the hand to a target position. Equipping and aiming complete. Now on to shooting. Again, this is a place where multiplayer makes things difficult. Remember latency? It's back, baby. So let me begin by just saying, I want the server to be in control of the actual projectile that does damage. The bad way that I set it up to begin with was as follows. The player shoots, their client sends a message to the server to shoot, the server spawns a projectile, and then that projectile is spawned on each of the clients. The projectile has a network transform on it and replicates its movement back to the clients. However, this movement is interpolated, so the clients actually have a slightly delayed version of what the projectile is actually doing on the server. The way to solve this is to do something like client predictive movement, which essentially lets the client predict and render what an object will do, and then when it disagrees with the server, it just conforms to whatever the server says. In this case, when the player shoots, I spawn a dummy projectile on their client and send it on its way. The server later receives the message to shoot and spawns its own projectile, but in this case I take into account the time difference between when the message was sent and received so I can scoot the projectile up to match what the client would expect. Then I send a message to all the other clients about the projectile and they spawn their own dummies, and also take into account the time difference so that they can scoot their dummy projectiles up to match the server. Then when the projectile hits something on the server, it tells all the clients to snap their dummy projectiles to the server position. Now everyone should see basically the same thing. But the fun doesn't end there. No. I still love pain, so I decided I wanted to make the arrows stick into the character and follow their animations. This meant adding colliders to every bone in a character, mapping their collision to a new layer, and fiddling with everything that came before it so that it all worked together. Then when they hit a character, we parent a dummy projectile to the bone that got hit and delete it after some delay. I actually still have to fix some bugs with this, as you can see from the footage in the latest playtest. Look, I also wrote some code about ammo and reloading and whatever, but by comparison, that was a straight shot. And that was the last weapon I've made so far, besides the longsword, which is basically just a left-handed stick. Keeping in line with expanding our content horizons, I needed to make some new armor types. The first one I made was a gambeson armor. This one was basically just to test what a partial sprite swap would look like if I replaced the arms and not the hands, and to have a lighter armor for the lower tier of protection. It also let me sort out some of the weight painting stuff with flappy skirts, and overall it was a success. The other type of armor was what I like to call the dingy chainmail. This concept was to prove out armor that would layer on top of the character sprites. It features revealing holes, limited shoulder coverage, and more leg than any armor that came before it. This was actually a big hurdle. In order to layer armor on top of the already animating character sprites, you can't just attach it to the same transform and call it a day. You have to make sure that the animations are mapping to the mesh of the armor in the same way they do to the character sprite below it. Now, it turns out that Unity doesn't really let you do this at runtime. In the sprite skin component, which is basically the thing that animates sprites with an armature, the variables you need to update to map the sprite skin to the bones at runtime are flagged as private. This basically means you can't access them or update them. Or does it? I don't have a computer science degree, and it could be that when you go through school they teach you these kinds of things, but I am using GitHub Copilot, and the AI-powered coding assistant really helped me out here. I asked it to figure out how I could modify these variables, and it came up with an approach using a reflection to set the values. I'm not going to pretend to understand exactly how it works, but it does work, and if somebody wants to explain it to me in the comments, I'd appreciate that. Anyways, with that sorted out, I now had 3 armor items in the game and had proved out the process for how any armor could be made. A hat is the cleanest drip when you're bald like me. There were 2 new kinds of helmets I wanted to make. The first helmet was one that went on top of the head. Well, I guess they all do that, but this one also showed the hair underneath. I made what I like to call the beekeeper helmet. It's a fashionable helmet with a wide brim. I render the back of the brim behind the head of the character and the front on top of the hair. Then I have to manipulate a sprite mask on the hair so that it only renders in the areas that the hair is visible. Done and dusted. The next kind of helmet fit more tightly to the noggin. Here I ran into the first and only time so far I would have to adjust the customization system I had made oh so very long ago. Different hairstyles will poke out of the helmet, and due to the way that the shapes overlap, a simple masking of the hair won't do. Instead, I have to make sure to make like an under a tight helmet option for each of the hairstyles, or otherwise the characters will just look bald when they wear a tight helmet. Yeah, so okay, helmets are done. Now I want to put all my new toys to use. Skeletons. With all my new fancy weapons and armor, I wanted to make a couple of humanoid enemies to use them. I settled on the all-time classic. I drew up a skelly, mapped it to the human armature, and started to figure out how it would be different from a rat. From a design perspective, I wanted enemies to fit into several archetypes, so I wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel every time I wanted to introduce a new enemy. For the first 3 enemies, I settled on a Zerg Rush enemy, the rat, a heavy melee enemy, an axe skeleton, and a more skittish ranged enemy. The rats would simply rush at a target and attack. The axe skeleton would move to the target, attack, but could also change up their movement and hopefully avoid some attacks. And the crossbow skeleton would pepper you with shots from a distance and run away if you got too close. I branched off the humanoid character class to make each of their brains and started working on their behavior. Due to the upfront work I had done with all of my other classes, this was actually pretty straightforward. The damage receiver, effect handler, items, action manager, pretty much everything worked right out of the box. The most difficult part of this was actually figuring out how to tell the crossbow skeleton where to run. If I told them to keep moving away from the target, they could be cornered very easily. If I told them to just pick a random location, they would move towards the player at times when it didn't really make sense. So the solution ended up being, well, when the crossbow skeleton wants to move away from a target, I iterate through each of the nodes in the whole movement graph and check if they are a certain distance away from the target. If they are, then I add them to a list of viable options. Then I check if the skeleton is to the left or the right of the target, and depending on that, I add those nodes to a list of prioritized options. If the skeleton can find a node in the prioritized options to go to, it'll go there, essentially backing away from the target. If it can't find a node on that list, then it'll pick one of the other options, which are on the other side of the target, and run over there. Is it optimized? Well, we are cycling through like 1600 nodes, so maybe not. But we only do it once in a while, and I always say, optimization is a lifestyle. When it becomes a problem, I'll find another solution. At this point, I was really sick of looking at the disgusting default UI. I was also told that my art for the environment, aka the props in the room, was not so great. So I enlisted the help of a friend to help me make some artwork. Jennifer is a professional game artist, and she was attracted to the kooky, quirky, incredible vibes of Badventure. It's been a real godsend to have her help out. I'm going to link to her portfolio in the description if you want to check out some of her other work. And for those of you who say, aha, gotcha, you're not really a solo developer, whatever, bro. Jennifer made some assets for the lobby, and it instantly was a much more pleasant experience to work on. I think when you're working on a game, progress is really hard to earn and often not immediately apparent, but dressing up something like the UI can go a long way to building back momentum and enthusiasm. Next, Jennifer started working on some assets for the Dungeon Master UI, and she made a sprite placeholder for the Dungeon Master themselves. The Dungeon Master UI still isn't final, but it is closer to where we want to go eventually. Like I said, the goal is to make the Dungeon Master experience feel tactile. I want you to actually roll the dice. I want the scrolls to animate when they open. I want to give you a toy to play with that serves no other gameplay purpose. However, this is a far cry better than the Drek I was rocking before. We added an enemy counter, we added a round counter, we added graphics for gold, a looking glass to peer into the previous room, and now this was actually starting to look like a game. A game! It's like our little sausage now had some packaging. Jennifer also revamped the dungeon room background and redid all of the existing props as well. We established some rules for our visual hierarchy, and we had some art direction that we could stick to for the rest of development. At this point, the adventurers did not have any kind of inventory interface. In fact, they barely had an inventory at all. The options were equip something or drop it. Something had to be done. I decided I wanted to go with a drag and drop style inventory, like Minecraft or Diablo or countless other games. The inventory was split up into a few sections. General storage, where you could stick anything. Gear, where only your weapons and armor would go. Trinkets, which are passive buff items, and I'll talk more about that later. And we had the hotbar, where you would place active items to be used in the heat of the moment. In the inventory manager, I set up arrays for each of these. I created functions for adding an item to an index or simply finding the first available slot to put that item in. Then I did some artwork for the inventory. Many inventories in games are like, just UI windows. I could have done some kind of neutral box and called it a day, but I thought it would be fun if the inventory felt more like it was a part of the world. I played around with the idea of a backpack, but I couldn't actually figure out how to hack it and use the space well. This idea may come back in the future when I have more time and resources to dedicate to it, but I ended up going with some kind of rough leather sheet, loosely implied to be a sack. The sheet has a burlap pocket for general storage, a couple of pockets for the hotbar, some fittings for the gear, and a couple of lines to tie trinkets to. I also added a mirror to look at the character and a dog tag to identify their corpse. Now things get hellish. I made a script called the Inventory Menu Manager. This would be in charge of the visuals and controls of letting the player mess about in their inventory. I'm not kidding when I tell you right now this script is twice as long and way more complicated than any other script in the game. But why? Dragging stuff around doesn't seem so hard, right? Except, what if you drag the wrong kind of item in a slot, like a weapon, into the trinket area? Or do the opposite and drag a trinket into an occupied general storage slot? What if you swap a two-handed weapon for two one-handed weapons and there's no space in your inventory? It's complicated, and it gets more complicated with stacking items. As a general rule, the idea is to mostly swap places if you drop an item into an occupied slot. If you can't swap places, then look for the first available spot the item can go. And if there isn't any slot available, you just drop it off the character. The long short of it is, I need to know where an item came from in the inventory, its index, what kind of item it is, and basically execute a bunch of complicated logic based on that information. Then we start looking at usability. An inventory needs to be not confusing. So we do things like highlight slots you might be considering dropping in. Additionally, if you drop an item anywhere inside of the inventory, it will go into general storage. If you drop an item outside of the leather, then it's dropped off the character. If you right-click, it auto-equips the item where it would feasibly want to go, or unequips it if it's in an equipped slot already. Essentially, all of this adds up to a massive script that manages all of this behavior. Now, I could do a whole section on the tooltip, but this video is already super long and maybe not even that entertaining, so I know I've mentioned trinkets a couple times, but I haven't even really made one yet. Trinkets are items that give passive buffs or debuffs to the character. They can make you move faster, give resistances or bonuses to damage, or do crazy things like make you shoot 3 times the projectiles. I wanted some of them to be simple power additions and others to make super fun interactions for deep build crafting. Trinket effects would be fed into the effect handler and all would be well with the world. For my first trinket, I figured I would go simple. Let's just add a bonus to movement speed. I made a winged sandal like the ones worn by my boy Hermes, or for the posh among you, Hermes. I also set up effects in the effect handler to be placeholders for every type of bonus or resistance to damages and non-hit effects. This thing only took like a few hours to make tops, so I'm going to be making a ton of them in the future. After making such an underwhelming trinket, I wanted to have a little more fun with my first active item. But before I get into that, let me just delineate between the 2 types of active items. We have what I'm calling tools, which are active items that are not consumed on use. And then we have consumables, which, you guessed it, get consumed. Both of these have cooldowns and can give a variety of effects, sort of like trinkets, but for a limited duration. I decided to make a tool that would let the player go ethereal for a limited time. This would be a damage avoidance and positioning tool, and essentially make the player unable to collide or interact with anything corporeal while it's active. I first encountered an effect like this in Skyrim, but I'm sure other games have done something like it as well. So I made a pet ghost item, and then I decided it would need to spawn a pond to follow the player and float around woozily. Then I set about making the effect. Now I gotta come clean here. I've actually skipped over a bunch of work I've done over the year. I know, unbelievable, right? One of the things I worked on was shaders, and shaders accomplish things like the taking damage effect or having the player disappear into the portal. But here we are on like page 24 or 25 of the script anyways, and I don't want to make this go too long. I added a subgraph to my shader to render the character translucent when they go ethereal. Next, I created the functionality to change every collider in the player to a layer that only collides with walls, and then change them back to their original layer when the effect ends. I added the effect and functionality to the effect handler, and then added the necessary logic to the weapon script, the projectile script, the AI, and the damage receiver to get the effect I wanted. However, in the past week or so, I've had a dreadful feeling about this item. Giving players essentially no-clip functionality in an item could be a very, very bad idea. They can get stuck, hide indefinitely. It could easily be a disaster. Let me know your thoughts in the comments if you have an opinion on this or any ideas on how to solve it. For the consumable, I was back to boring. I made a health potion. I already had methods to heal the player in the health bar, so I just made the artwork, plugged everything in, and spawned a little effect when the player heals. Except this was also where I introduced stacking items, and that was a whole big issue, but looting is a serious addiction for RPG players. We all know it. Who hasn't gone on a dangerous journey to find the secret path to an item you saw out of the corner of your eye, and turns out it's something worthless. But if you hadn't gone, the craving would still be like gnawing at your insides, fiending for the loot. Badventure doesn't work like that. At the end of a round, a loot chest spawns and busts like a piñata, showering the good people with goodies. Jennifer made an animation for the chest, I made a couple of particle effects, and visually we had something. Then I set up another scriptable object for the master loot table. This would house all of the loot possibilities, and for now it's organized by round, although this is going to need to change later. Yeah, I'll deal with that later. I gave each possibility a weight and wrote the functionality to calculate and display the percentage chance for that item. Then I added everything we have right now because the game lacks content. I decided to randomize the loot at the beginning of the game, and the game manager actually handles all this. This means the game actually knows all the loot that will be offered each round in the first second of the game. You might be wondering, why? Well, I'm open to the idea of the Dungeon Master having some kind of influence over the loot. Whether that looks like secretly cursing an item, changing what spawns, replacing something with rubbish, all of the above, I'm not sure yet, but I am leaving the door open to the possibility. Anyways, then I made a simple function for spawning the loot and giving it some diverging trajectories so not everything lands on top of each other. Next, I added a loot chest spawning location to each of the layouts in the game and finally had a way to poof a loot chest into existence at the end of a round. So 1 year, thousands of lines of code, and gallons of coffee consumed later, what you've seen is what I got. I don't know exactly when this video is going to go live, but as of the recording of this audio, we actually did our first playtest about a week ago. Unfortunately, it seemed like a million things went wrong. We had a bug with the pathfinding, a bug with the lobby, bugs with the projectiles, bugs with the wind conditions, but in my experience for a first playtest, this is pretty normal. Despite all this, the playtest was really fun. The game is fun. That's huge, and I'm going to take that W. Where does it go from here? Well, besides a couple bug fixes, most of the core systems are in place, but there are some things I still want to add. Specifically, I am confident that the adventurers will have plenty of things to do to keep them entertained and engaged, but I am a little worried that the Dungeon Master will not have enough interaction. I think I would like the Dungeon Master to have more opportunity to have an active role in the room being cleared by the adventurers. I also plan on adding classes and class abilities to the adventurers to give more separation of roles for cooperative play. This will add some more of the role-playing element back into the game and give adventurers unique properties to take with them throughout the experience. Other than that, it's just more content. A handful of items and enemies isn't enough to make this sausage sing. I need to expand. If you want to support the project, get involved, pitch ideas, or give feedback, the best way is to join our Discord. It's free, the link is below, and you can influence or keep up to date with the game's development. Of course, we have other social media, and if you want to follow, those links are below. And I would be remiss without saying you should like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you made it this far, thank you for watching and hearing me out. I hope you were entertained, learned something, or were just sufficiently distracted from whatever you're procrastinating at the moment. I'm going to be releasing videos more regularly in the future, and I hope to see you there. Peace, love, and sausages.